Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak here on this wonderful opportunity. Boker Tov. The topic today is a topic that I really thought that maybe, perhaps, in some miraculous way, would be a discussion from about an event that happened to us in the past. We could maybe reflect on it, looking back, about using Zoom to keep mitzvot. And unfortunately, it seems this matter is an ongoing one, and that the question is relevant and practical, and it has been for the past almost 2 years. So I think it's unfortunate, but I think it's also very important to maybe to remind us of how, with all the troubles that we have right now with the corona, we are very fortunate to have the opportunity to use technology and to be involved in mitzvot, even in times when we're not really able to leave the house as much as we would like to, and to meet up with people. So I think that this shiur is not only about discussing the possibilities of performing mitzvot with Zoom. I hope it's also going to give us a little bit of optimism, some kind of optimistic feelings and emotions about the fact that Baruch Hashem, we are able to perform some mitzvot on Zoom. Now, when I mentioned this idea of performing mitzvot on Zoom, I imagine that most people, or many people, think automatically about Tefillah b'minyan, about Kaddish, about mitzvot, which I would call right now more ben adam lamakom. And I would like to actually focus today more on mitzvot ben adam l'chaveiro. And I'll explain. Most of the questions that have been discussed the past few months during this epidemic using Zoom has been whether or not you can daven a minyan on Zoom, you can say Kaddish, you can answer to Kaddish, can you answer to a bracha? When Purim coming up soon, we'll discuss again probably all the questions of hearing Megillah on Zoom, hearing Havdalah, etc. But I don't think that many have thought of using Zoom in use Zoom, but can Zoom be performed? Can be used halachically for mitzvot sheben adam lechaveiro, like bikur chalim, nichum avelim, and even maybe l'sameach chatan v'kala. It's very popular, it's very common that we participate today on Zoom weddings, and it's becoming. I just had this week a student of mine who I was supposed to do his wedding, and unfortunately I had to be on Zoom as if I could to participate in the wedding. Would that be halachically considered a mitzvah to misamech chatan v'kala to be on a Zoom or not? So I would like to discuss these questions. I'll just mention before we start that here we are, first of all, proving that you can perform mitzvot on Zoom by learning Torah. There's no question that learning Torah on Zoom is a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. I don't think that anyone questions the mitzvah of Talmud Torah on Zoom. So we can start at least with one mitzvah that we are for sure performing, even perhaps the best way you can on Zoom. I don't know if there's really much difference sitting in a shiur in a classroom learning Torah than doing it on Zoom. You can argue, some people like it better, some people like it worse, but from the mitzvah perspective, I don't think there's anything different in the mitzvah of learning Torah on Zoom than being live in a classroom. And now let's start with the mitzvot that I want to discuss, and we'll start with mitzvot ben adam lechaveiro, specifically bikur cholim. And my question is, can the mitzvah of visiting the sick, bikur cholim, be done on a Zoom with Zoom technology? Are you fulfilling the mitzvah? Now, obviously, I think it's a given. I'll just say that if you can't go to someone, if you can't visit someone, obviously you should do it on Zoom. My conclusion is not to tell people not to do anything on Zoom. But my question is, what are the halachic definitions of Bikur Cholim, and whether or not they can be fulfilled on Zoom? So let's start from the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. What is the source that teaches us that you must visit the sick? So there are two well-known sources. One of them, if you look at your source on source number one, your source sheet, I will also put it on the screen. Here we go. I hope you can see it. Here we go. I'm sorry, the only source I have in English is source number one. Don't get if those don't think that the rest are going to be in English. I'm sorry, this is the only English I have, but I will obviously go through every source that I discuss. The Rambam in Chot Avel tells us that there's a mitzvah midivrei sofrim, a rabbinical mitzvah to visit the sick, comfort the mourners, to prepare a funeral, prepare a bride, to attend the needs of a burial, carry a corpse on the shoulder, meaning all mitzvot be'adam lechaveiro, the Rambam brings together in one halacha. And the Rambam tells us that all these deeds of kindness are mitzvah derabanan, which I think that if you read this Rambam, if you never saw this Rambam before, it really is a big surprise to learn that all these mitzvot of Bikur Cholim, Nichum Avelim, Halvayat Hamet, mitzvot that are so essential, so important in the hierarchy of mitzvot, they're only derabanan, they're only divrei sofrim. Really? It's a bit strange. However, the Rambam continues and teaches us, although all these mitzvot are rabbinic origin, they are included in the mitzvah d'oraita of ve'avta l'reacha kamocha. This itself is an interesting idea, where we have a mitzvah d'oraita of ve'avta l'reacha kamocha, and yet fulfilling the mitzvah in the way that we do today, meaning it boils down to visit the sick, to go to a levaya. The Rambam understood that this is derabanan. It's a very strange idea. It's not so easy to understand. I was just happened to read last night, an article of Rabbi Soloveitchik, in which Rabbi Soloveitchik explains that this model is a difficult model to understand, but it exists in other places. He talks about, for example, the mitzvah of oneg Shabbat and kavod Shabbat, which are not deoraita, right? To eat a good meal on Shabbat, to dress in a certain way for Shabbat is a mitzvah midivrei Kabbalah, midivrei Sofrim, it's midivrei Nevi'im, it's not a deoraita mitzvah. However, Rav Soloveitchik says that by performing them, you are performing the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat, meaning there are some times that our rabbis teach us certain behaviors that one must do, but by doing them, we are fulfilling a deoraita mitzvah. It's a little bit of a strange idea, but it's quite clear that by visiting the sick, even though the rabbis taught us that we must visit the sick, but by doing it, ultimately we are fulfilling the mitzvah of ve'avta l'reacha kamocha. So that might be one source, if not the most important source of Bikur Cholim. However, there's an alternative source, which Rabbi Soloveitchik elsewhere talks quite a lot about and tries to highlight its importance, and that is the Midrash and the Gemara that appears in several places that teaches us that man must always strive to walk in the footsteps of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that man must always try to imitate the attributes and the characteristics of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ve'alachta bidrachav. You must go in the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara says in several places, it talks about how it's almost impossible to communicate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu physically because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Eish Ochla. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is fire. And of course, how can one ever touch fire? And the Gemara answers that it's not about necessarily physically attaching one to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but rather imitating the characteristics of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is one of the most important principles of Judaism. The Rav of Soloveitchik writes about this, how this might be one of the most important principles in the Torah, to try to imitate the Baruch Hu. And we learn, the Midrash says, Mahu mevaker cholim, af atam mevaker cholim. Mahu kover metim, af ata kover metim. We learn that the Baruch Hu visited Avram, and that the Baruch Hu visited Avram when he was sick after the Brit Milah on the third day. So we learn from HaKadosh Baruch Hu visiting the sick that we must also visit the sick. HaKadosh Baruch Hu buried Moshe Rabbeinu. We learn from here that we must also bury people. This is a way of imitating the characteristics and the attributes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will try to prove that the Rambam understood that both these sources are in fact the sources that teach us about mitzvot ben adam lechavero. And I think they're actually the first one, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, is quite normal. I would say that that's a source that we can that's not so difficult to understand. However, the second source I think that we just discussed is a very fundamental one, a very important one, understanding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu requires us to behave in a certain way and to be kind to others. That is one of the main characteristics of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After we said that, let's try to understand in the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, what is included, what is the purpose, what is the idea of visiting the sick, what are we trying to achieve when we visit the sick? So I think that the first thing that comes to people's minds would be to take care of the sick person, to make sure that they have all their needs, that they have a cup of tea, that they have their medicine, that they are taken care of, that they are seeing a doctor. I would assume that that would be the first idea of what Bikur Cholim is all about. And the truth is, if you look in source number 2, we see that in fact, that is a Gemara that seems to indicate that that is the main idea of Bikur Cholim. Ma'aseh b'talmid echad mitalmidei Rabbi Akiva shechala. There was a student of Rabbi Akiva that was sick. Lo nichnasu chachamim levakro, and the rabbis did not visit. I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but we all know that Rabbi Akiva's students definitely had a certain issue with kavod zeh bazeh. We know that Chazal rebuked the students of Rabbi Akiva that were not always necessarily kind to each other, not respectful to each other. Perhaps that's what brought Rabbi Akiva to really highlight ve'avta l'recha kamocha. Perhaps Rabbi Akiva's idea that this is a very important mitzvah was a result of his students. And here again, we see perhaps some hint to the fact that they were not necessarily so kind to each other. And Rabbi Akiva had to go in and visit his Talmud. V'nichnas Rabbi Akiva levakro, ubishvil shekibdo v'ribto lefanav chaya, meaning the fact that Rabbi Akiva walked into the room and gave and took care of him, that itself gave this Talmud livelihood, and he as if woke up and he became better. Amarle Rebbe Yichiyatani, Rebbe, you have cured me. Yatzar Rabbi Akiva b'darash kol mi she'ein mevaker cholim ki'ilu shofech damim. Rabbi Akiva said that really a person should mevaker cholim because you're aiding the person and giving him help. You know, I have to tell. This reminds me of a story that I had when I was a young boy. When I was a young kid, Erev Yom Kippur, I wasn't feeling well. I had quite high fever. I was in Yeshivat Har Etzion with my Abba, Alav Shalom, and my father was a little bit concerned that I was really not well. He took me before Kol Nidre to Rav Lichtenstein and discussed with him, how should I fast? What should I do? During the entire Yom Kippur, I stayed in bed with fever, but I was able somehow to make it for Ne'ilah to the Bet Midrash of Yeshivat Har Etzion, and I came up from the back stairs. I'm sure some people are familiar with the Yeshivat Har Etzion, the back stairs in the back, and I walk up slowly in the back, and I was really not well. I was fasting barely. I don't know how I did it. I walk up and I sit in the back of the Bet Midrash. Ne'ilah is about to start, And I don't know how, Rav Lichtenstein turned back and he saw me from the corner of his eye, and he walked over from one side of the Bet Midrash to the other side. And because he left his place, they didn't start Ne'ilah. And he came over to me, and I'm a little boy, and he started asking me how I'm feeling, and do I think I can still daven, and can I do Ne'ilah? And he gave me so much attention and care right before Ne'ilah. I say to people, I sometimes felt that I was in the middle of a Hasidic story, right? The whole Bet Midrash is waiting to start Ne'ilah, and the Rosh Yeshiva is taking care of a young kid who is not feeling well. And I feel that when I read the story about Rabbi Akiva, that went to visit his student, and the great Rabbi Akiva is visiting student, then that's what gave the koach. And I felt the same way. I felt that once Rav Lichtenstein gave me all that attention, I davened Ne'ilah. I felt so much better. I could daven Ne'ilah standing up. I really felt that he gave me koach. So there is something about that the person who visits the sick is there to give him strength, to take care of his needs, to aid him to feel better. By the way, I remember telling the story to Mrs. Lichtenstein, to Dr. Lichtenstein, and the Rebbitzin told me she didn't understand why I was so excited. She said, "I don't understand. He just went to see how you're feeling. Why is that so? It's normal. Everyone should do that, right? So what if he's a great rabbi? Everyone should go over and see how people are and how they feel." And that is true to some level, but I think when it comes from people like great people, then we always feel a bit more special. However, if you go back to the Gemara, you will notice that there is an additional opinion hinting to us what is the purpose of Bikur Cholim. Rav Dimi Amar, Kol she'ein mivaker choleh, ein mivakesh alav rachamim, lo sheyichyeh velo sheyamut. Rav Dimi seems to suggest that there is another idea of what Bikur Cholim entails, and that is the responsibility for one to pray for the welfare of the Choleh. When you go visit someone that is sick, your responsibility as part of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is to pray for the health of that person. And the Ramban, in source number 3, you can see, took this very seriously and ruled, Hilkach, therefore, Kol mevaker et hacholeh velo bikesh alav rachamim lo kiyem hamitzvah. The Ramban says, if you do not pray for the welfare, for the health of the Choleh, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So, according to this Ramban, an essential part of Bikur Cholim is praying for the welfare of that Choleh. If that is true, I think we can now ask the question whether or not visiting the sick on Zoom would fulfill the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. This question, I am not aware of this question being asked about Zoom, but this question was asked many years ago by Rav Moshe Feinstein regarding a telephone call. Rav Moshe already years and years ago discussed using a telephone for Bikur Cholim. And if you look at your source number, your source sheet, if you look at source number 4, you will see, right, that Rav Moshe writes here, Be'inyan Bikur Cholim al Yidei telephone. Telephone, as you can see, is written with 2 ayins and 1 aleph, which is for Moshe is only using 2 ayins and 1 aleph is pretty short. Elevator has 7 ayins, I think. Anyway, about a telephone. Hinei pashut la'aniyut da'ati, to my humble opinion, av shemitayem mitzvat Bikur Cholim, aval eino shayach lomar sheyatza yedei chova. But Moshe says, obviously, like we said before, if there's no other choice, you can only visit someone on the phone, do it on a phone call. But you should know, says Rav Moshe, that you are not fulfilling the mitzvah the way you should. And if you can, you should visit that person and come to their home, because you're not fulfilling all the details of mitzvat bikur cholim. And what are those details? So he says in the source sheet, in the source in front of you, he says that it's because, for example, בשבילתם שימצא נחת רוח בזה, שאין שייך זה שלא בפניו. But Moshe says, it's something about the person being in your presence that will make them feel better. If you're there and you see them and you're surrounding them and your presence is with them, then the idea of Bikur Cholim being some kind of cure, making the person feel better, that cannot be accomplished on a telephone call. For that, you need your physical presence there. Now, you could argue, and this is open for argument, whether or not Zoom today would have that effect, that perhaps when someone sees your face on a television screen, perhaps that would really make a difference. I want to point your attention to, I think perhaps the most amazing source that I found regarding this matter, from a tshuva of the Minchat Yitzchak. The Minchat Yitzchak Dayan Weiss, who came from Europe and for many years lived in Manchester, was a Dayan in Manchester, and then later on moved to Yerushalayim and became the Av based in the Eda Charedis. In source number 5, from the year 1956, and this is what's fascinating to me, also discusses whether or not you can perform the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim on a telephone. And he says, I don't think so. And he argues the same argument that Moshe said, you need the presence, you need to be there. However, look what he says here. Imit pateach ha-television. You see, again, television here has 2 ayins and 2 vavs. Television, right? Imit pateach ha-television. L'shimush yechidim kemo ha-telephone. V'yeh yecholet lirot ha-chole u'l'saper imo כי ידבר איש אל רעהו פנים בפנים. בוודאי אין צריכים שיראה כל דבר על שירו האמיתי. This is the most amazing tshuva that I found in this context. He basically says, listen, telephone call won't do it. But if they develop one day a technology in which there will be 2 television screens on both sides of the people talking to each other, and they will be able to not only speak to each other, but see each other's faces, then perhaps I would argue that the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim would be fulfilled the way it should be. And that, of course, is a video conference or Zoom or WhatsApp, with the video WhatsApp. So he, in 1956, is already talking about the future of having a Zoom Zoom talk, which he argued would be fulfilling the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So that's one reference that I think is quite amazing. However, going back to Rav Moshe Feinstein, we will notice, what is he also concerned about? What other issues does Rav Moshe say that are problematic with the Zoom when it comes to Bikur Cholim? He says, "V'gam michemat we said that before, seeing the face, noticing that the person is next to him will make him feel better." However, it's the last line here, which I think is the most important one. V'gam ulai mitkabelet sham hatfila biyoter, mishum de'ashchina mitzuya im hacholeh. Chazal teach us that when a person is sick, the Shechina is in the room with him. Above the head of the chole is the Shechina. And we just learned, according to the Ramban, we learned that the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is about praying for the person that is sick. I would like to add to this idea, you don't have it in front of you, but the Rambam in Chot Avel, when he talks about the mitzvah Bikur Cholim, he really tells us the following. One second. Here we go. Bikur Cholim, mitzvah alakol. Afilu gadol mevaker katan. Even a great person must visit someone lower than him, as if, or an adult to a child. Umevakrin harbe pamim biyom. V'kol ha-mevaker et hacholeh ki'ilu natal chelik micholyo. If you visit the sick, you are taking away his sickness. What we said before, that by being there, you're aiding him. However, the Rambam says explicitly, he says, "Hanichnas levaker et hacholeh lo yeshev lo agabei mita lo agabei kisei." You shouldn't sit down. Why not? Why can't you sit down when you visit the sick? Says the Rambam, "Ela mitatef v'yoshev," right where a talit, yoshev lemata mimarashotav umevakesh alav rachamim v'yotzeh. The Rambam says explicitly that an essential part of Bikur Cholim is also to pray for the health of the person. And the Rambam connects the mitzvah of praying for the Choleh to be doing it in his presence. And in his presence, because that is the Choleh, where he is, that's where the Shechina is. You should daven where the Shechina is, and you should daven for the health of that person. So Rav Moshe argues that if you do not visit the Choleh, then you can daven for him. That's true. But there is something special about davening for the Choleh in his house, in front of him, where you are standing next to him. That itself is part of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, and that cannot be done obviously on a Zoom in the same way. Recently, I'm just going to, spoiler alert, I was sent a few weeks ago an article that has been written from a shiur that my father gave many years ago. And Har Etzion is putting out a book now, and they asked to put this article in the book. It's an article of my Abba, a shiur about Hamevakesh Rachamim al Chavero, the idea that you should, that Chazal teach us that a person should always pray for his or her friend. And my father, in this article that I never read until recently, really says that, according to what we just learned now, the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is really the idea of a person asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for rachamim for his fellow friend. This idea that we should always be concerned and worried about others when we pray is essentially part of Bikur Cholim. And my father then really speaks about our question, whether or not you can do it on a telephone. Why? Because he says, can you do Bikur? He asks a different question. Can you do Bikur Cholim by a messenger? Can you send someone on your behalf to visit the sick? So again, if the idea of visiting the sick is to ensure that all they're all taken care of, then of course you can send a messenger. But if it's to pray for someone, it's about you praying for that person. You can't send someone on your behalf to pray for someone. It has to come from you. Your prayer and your friend's prayer is different. When you pray for your friend and you think about him and your connection and relationship to him, it comes from a very personal place of yours, and that prayer cannot be done by anyone else but yourself. And the same way, my father argued that using a telephone for that purpose would not achieve the same idea of physically going to visit the sick. However, and this is interesting, I think that Rav Hutner might disagree with what we just said now. I'm not sure it's a real disagreement, but he does seem to argue that Bikur Cholim can be done by a telephone call. And I will open up the source sheet again to source number 8. Source number 8, Rav Hutner, in one of his letters, I have the book in front of me. This is a book of Igrot U'Michitavim, letters of Rav Yitzchak Hutner. He said something quite interesting about our question. I will read it here. He says like this. regarding visiting the sick, he says, "V'lo od ela shenireh ki tirguma shel hamilah bikur." Says, what does the word bikur mean? And the word bikur cholim, I think we would probably, if someone would ask us what it means, we would translate it into levaker, is to visit, right? He says, no, eino visit. You see it? Eino visit. It's not the word to visit. Rather, shetigramo milshon bikor ela milshon bikoret tiyeh. Klomar ha'iyun b'matzavo shel hacholeh. Isn't that interesting? It's not about visiting the sick, it's about levaker. Levaker in Hebrew is to criticize, right? Mevaker Medina is an official government position whose job is to criticize the government's actions, right? Levaker is to criticize, to investigate. And Rav Hutner says that the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim ultimately is to investigate, is to ensure that the chola is being taken care of. He even says, oh, I made a mistake here. I'm sorry. It's ukederech. It's not. Wait 1 second. I can see that I typed this wrong. Ukederech she'amru gabei korbanot ta'un bikur. The halacha is that when you bring a korban, you have to do bikur. Right? What does that mean? You have to visit the animal? Of course not. Levaker, it's a behema, means to check, to investigate, to make sure that the behema is kosher for a korban. Also here says Rav Hutner, the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is ensuring that a person is well taken care of. And therefore, says Rav Hutner, I believe that can be performed on a telephone, that can be done from distance. So to sum it up, we saw that at least 3 different poskim have discussed the question of using technology like a phone and perhaps even a Zoom to visit the sick. Obviously, we understand that if there's no other choice, a person should Zoom someone, should make a telephone call to visit the sick. And Rav Moshe says that you are performing part of the mitzvah. According to Dayan Weiss, perhaps you are fulfilling the entire mitzvah on a Zoom more than a telephone call. So if you had a choice to make a telephone call or a live video call or a Zoom call, according to Rav Weiss, you should really prefer doing Bikur Cholim on a Zoom when that person can actually see your face. Praying is a little bit of a tricky one, as we said, that perhaps if the mitzvah to Bivaker Cholim is to really pray, then perhaps only going to that person's house would fulfill that aspect of Bikur Cholim. According to Rav Hutner, theoretically, Bikur Cholim by phone or by a Zoom call would be just as good as going to someone's house performing this mitzvah. I don't want to talk about this because this is a side issue. It's a very interesting one. Should a person do Bikur Cholim if you are concerned that you might pick up a bug or a virus? This is true, by the way, not only about Corona. It's true about any person that's sick, right? If someone has a bad cold and you go visit him. So theoretically, you can also get that cold. Should you? That's a side question, which I'm not going to go into right now. And perhaps that if people are concerned of picking up viruses and bugs, then technology really allows us to perform part of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. What about Nichum Avelim? It's unfortunately many people during the past 2 years have been in positions where they had to sit shiva without visitors, and fortunately, Zoom technology really did allow at least some kind of Nichum Avelim. Is that really also the mitzvah? Can the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim be performed on the phone or on Zoom? Here again, we have some sources that shed some light, perhaps, on the characteristics of the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim. Here again, as we said before, Nichum Avelim is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that goes back to the mitzvah d'oraita of Ahavta l'recha kamocha, and of course is also some kind of midah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But here, the poskim, also referring to Nichum Avelim, wrote the following. Here again, Rav Moshe Feinstein discussed this in source number 6. Source number 6, Rav Moshe was asked about doing Nichum Avelim on the phone, and he explained the characteristics of this mitzvah are a little bit different than other Ben Adam L'Chaveiro. Rav Moshe says, Hinei b'Nichum Avelim ika tarte inyani. He says there are two halachas. This is a really a brisker kind of observation of the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim. Chada, the first side of Nichum Avelim, letovat Avelim achayim, shem trudim me'od b'tza'aram, מחויבים לדבר על ליבו ולנחמו, שבשביל זה הרי גם כן מחויבים ללך לביתו שנמצא. Says Rav Moshe, there are two components that together create the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim. Now, the truth is that Rav Moshe is saying now is a yesod, is a principle, I would say, that runs through all mitzvot that have to do with Avelut. And the Gemara talks about this in many places. The Gemara explains that when it comes to mitzvot that have to do with burying the dead, Shiva, Avelut, the Gemara always mentions that there are two different sides here. One is the living and one is for the dead. The Gemara talks about this many times when it, for example, discusses what happens if a person dies and leaves a will in which he asks people not to sit shiva for him? If he asks people certain requests, how to honor him against the halakhic customs, do we listen to the wishes of the mate or not? Who do we go by? And the Gemara keeps on mentioning that this is dependent upon what we take more serious. Do we focus on Hilchot Avilut because they are about the person who was niftar, the mace, or is about the living? Are we focusing on those who are living, and the Hilchot Avilut are focused more on them? My Amba, alav shalom, once gave a shir. I thought it was, obviously it's my father, so I'm going to say it's a brilliant shir, but I thought it was a brilliant idea, and I've shared this with many people since, regarding Kaddish, that even Kaddish has these two sides to it. On one side, the Kaddish is, we say, for the memory of the niftar. We add as if Kedusha for the niftar that's not here. At the same time, the Kaddish also is about the living, about us, mentioning as if remembering the fact that this person is not with us, and somehow commemorating his memory by saying Kaddish. And you can see sometimes that certain customs that we do really have almost a machloket, right? What is more important? I'll give you an example. I'm assuming that most people here are Anglo-Saxons, so they are familiar with the minhag that people say to people when they have a yahrzeit. Now, I'm Israeli. I was born here, and I have to tell you that before I went to Chutz La'aretz, I've never heard or seen anyone say anything to a person who has a yahrzeit. In Israel, I'm not sure if any minhag exists. I lived in England for 2 years, and in England, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law are English. In England, on the day of the yahrzeit, people come over, and it's like a big thing, and they wish you long life, right? Are people aware of this? People that I can see. Have you ever heard this minhag? I wish you long life, Chaim Arukim, Chaim Aruchim. I don't know, it's a kaf or a chaf, it's a machloket, Chaim Aruchim or Chaim Arukim. But anyway, I remember seeing that people stand in line almost. It's it's a thing that everyone comes over to the person who says Kaddish, and no one, if someone doesn't say it, why don't they come over to me? In America, the minhag is to say, I wish the neshama should have an aliyah, right? I wish the neshama should have an aliyah. In Israel, they don't say anything, but in neshama should have an aliyah. So what's the why are there different minhag? So my father pointed out that perhaps in England, they really are focusing on the life, that the yahrzeit is focusing on us, those who are left here, and we wish you long life, while the minhag in America is again pointing out about the neshama, that the neshama should have an aliyah, right? So you feel the tension, as if, not a tension, but like the dynamics of a yortzeit, of a velut, always takes into account that we have two separate areas here that we must focus on, the live and the dead. And here, said Rav Moshe, Nichum Avelim has both ideas. We visit the mourners because we give them support and comfort, but we also have to honor the dead. And by the way, that is why the minhag of Shiva, the default of sitting Shiva, if there's no other choice, right? If there's no problem, is to sit Shiva in the house of the nifter. Some people are very makbid about this, to sit Shiva in the house of the person who died, because it's not just about giving nechama to the people who are sitting Shiva, it's about coming and giving some respect and honor to the person who was nifter. Said, now let's go back to the source sheet. Says Rav Moshe, from the side of the Tovat Avelim, going to the house, perhaps that we can fulfill by a telephone call. However, the Tovat HaMeit, Shenit LeTovat HaMeit, we go for the honor of the mate. Umashmali, it seems to me, says Rav Moshe, Mitzadav Velachai, Sheach Gam telephone, to comfort the mourners. If the idea is just to comfort them, that can be done on a telephone call, and we'll add Kal Vachomer, Agabi Kal Vachomer, that can be done on a Zoom call, and adding the person's face and face features, of course, will add to the nechama. However, says Rabbi Moshe, Aval ha-mitzvah shemitzad tovat ha-meit lo shayach ela davka l'kshiyavor sham b'makom shemitnachamim or b'makom shemeit. Says Rav Moshe, but if the focus and part of the mitzvah is to honor the mace, that requires your physical presence in the house of the niftar. That can only be done in a physical presence and not on a telephone. Lastly, in this matter, I want to point out again Rav Hutner. Rav Hutner, in the same letter that he wrote before, explaining why you can fulfill Bikur Cholim by a telephone, argues that Nichum Avelim cannot be done by a telephone at all. And this is a fascinating tshuva of Rav Hutner. I'll go back to the source sheet. If you look at this, at going back to source number 8, Rav Hutner has a chiddush almost about the essence of Nichum Avelim. He says something quite amazing. He says, Omnam legabein mitzvah tanchumei avelim, da'ati she'ein mitzvah zo mitkayemet al yidei sicha telefonit. It is not fulfilled by a telephone call. Ve'amina tamadidei, I'll tell you the reason. Hinei b'tanchumei avelim la'achar ha'kvura yesh din shel omdim b'shura. He says there's a famous minhag that I'm sure we're all aware of, that after the kvura, there's a shura. People stand in a line and the mourners walk by. Now, it's a minhag that when the mourners walk by the shura, we close on in them, right? If you notice, if you think about the, I don't want people to think about Levias, I'm sorry, but I'm sure if you remember that there's this minhag that as the mourners are walking through, all those who are already said, the minhag is to gather around the nifter, gather around the mourner, the live mourner, and to follow them on their journey. Says Rav Hutner, this is not just a small minhag. This is an idea of embracing the mourner, of giving him a physical sense of comfort. He says ulmidim anu mizeh shemitzvah tanchumei avilim eina be'abaa divrei tanchumin greda ela sheyesh din kviut shel misibat nechama. Do you hear that? It's an unbelievable phrase. He says misibat nechama. a party of comfort. Shekenu Loshon Rabbeinu. He says, he quotes Chazal, who say that when you come to Beit Avel, mekifin oto, you're supposed to surround him. You're supposed to surround him physically. And Rav Hutner says that obviously this can only be done in a physical way and not by a telephone call. Unlike Bikur Cholim, he says, Nichum Avelim cannot be done on a phone. It has to be done with the physical presence. So I brought up these different shuvot. I think that it's quite fascinating because besides the practical matter in front of us, I think we also were able today to understand maybe perhaps a little better what is included in the mitzvot ben adam lechaveiro of Bikur Cholim and of Nichum Avelim. That there are many components involved in these unique mitzvot, and that obviously, if we can't do them by physically going to that person's house, we should do it by phone. Better to do it on Zoom, and let's hope for better days where we can actually do it in bodies by going to that person. Because I think that we can conclude that in both these questions, it would be better to perform this mitzvah in a physical presence. And there's a lot to be said about physical presence. I think that many of us could agree that during these 2 years, that is something that has been missing for many of us, that physical presence, and that component is very important, especially when people are in trouble, when people have matters of discomfort and people that are down, then physical presence is very important. Of course, we are lucky to have the technology that we have that we can do at least that. What about the mitzvah of Simchat Chatan V'Kala? Are you Misameach Chatan V'Kala? I know it sounds funny, but maybe I should have. I did not wake up this week. My student got married in America, and it was 2:00 in the morning when the chuppah was. And I did not wake up. I called him right before I went to sleep and wished him a mazel tov. I was actually supposed to perform the wedding. I didn't make it to America because of this flights, but I called him and I went to sleep. I'm looking back now, should have I woken up at 3:00 in the morning to see the Zoom in order to Mesameach Chatan V'Kala? Would that be the mitzvah? So here, obviously, just in a practical level, it's a little bit different because Bikur Cholim Nichum Avelim, the people are actually seeing you and speaking to you. When you are watching a Zoom wedding and they during the chuppah can't see you, obviously, I don't think that would be performing the mitzvah of Sameach Chatan V'Kala. It says that you're supposed to, when you go to a wedding, you're supposed to dance. It seems quite clear that you're supposed to physically participate in a wedding, and that is part of the mitzvah of Simchat Chatan V'Kala. It could be, could be that if you're able during the wedding to do a Zoom call and show your face on the Zoom, that perhaps by making the Chatan V'Kala a bit happier, perhaps you can also fulfill the mitzvah of Simchat Chatan V'Kala by showing your face on the screen, by them seeing you seeing them. So I'm not going to delve upon Bichlal, the whole mitzvah of Simchat Chatan V'Kala is a very unusual one, by the way. It's a famous question. People ask, what exactly is the mitzvah? Because they're happy anyway, right? I mean, they're happy anyway. So what are you exactly supposed to make them more happy? They have their own happiness, right? So it's a famous question that people discuss. The mitzvah of Simchat Chatan V'Kala, perhaps the idea is that the Chatan V'Kala simcha should be shared by others, and by sharing it with others, then the simcha reaches higher levels. That's probably the idea. So if that can be achieved during the wedding by showing your face for a second, perhaps that would be also included in the mitzvah of Simchat Chatan V'Kala. So I basically went through the mitzvot ben adam lechaveiro that I wanted to. I have a few more minutes, and I'm happy just to go through a few other mitzvot that perhaps can be performed or not on Zoom. I just want to mention that there was during the pandemic, there was a fascinating story about a couple stuck in New Zealand on Shlichut. They were in New Zealand and they had a baby. And apparently New Zealand doesn't have any moalim, and they always rely on moalim from Australia. And for 3 months, this baby didn't have a bris. And after 3 months, they said enough is enough. They got in New Zealand, it was in the papers, so I'm sure it must be true, it was in the papers. They said that they got some doctor from New Zealand to stand by the father. A moel was on Zoom. And the moel explained to the doctor in New Zealand how to set up the bris. And the father actually did the bris with the doctor. So that might be the first ever bris on Zoom. Obviously, it's not what we're talking about, but it's quite amazing to think about it, that Zoom was used in some level to perform the mitzvah of Brit Milah. I'm, of course, referring to other mitzvot that require speech. I'm sure people heard about these ideas. I just want to mention, I'm not going to talk about davening because that's really a whole new topic and a different topic about being part of a minyan, answering for Kaddish and Kedusha. I'm sure people have heard a lot about this. It's been discussed quite a lot. I do want to mention, though, Havdalah, because that's more of a, I would say that is quite a practical question and a relevant one. I was once Shabbat by a certain rabbi in America, and would say Shabbat, his minhag is to make havdalah for his mother on the phone every Motzei Shabbos. His mother was an older woman, and she couldn't. She had some issues, medical problems, and he every Motzei Shabbos would make havdalah for her on the telephone. And this was based upon a tshuva, a very famous tshuva of Rabbi Moshe, who said that b'diavad almost. I think that was his language. You can see in a second. Permitted it. Here, this is an old famous question that has to do with Megillah, Havdalah, shofar. Theoretically, it's just very hard to imagine blowing shofar on a on the radio, but on a Yom Tov. But using microphones, using the famous questions here was whether or not you are actually hearing the voice. Is there a mitzvah to hear the voice? Or are you hearing a reflection of the voice, right? Because you're hearing some metal voice. It's not really that voice. Your voice can't carry that far. Obviously, what you're hearing is a translation. Technology somehow takes your voice and translates it into some mechanical way that you can hear something else. But are you actually hearing that voice? This was asked, this was discussed by so many poskim. I have in front of me here a tshuva of, where am I? I have two of the books open here. A tshuva of, where did I just put it? Sorry. Oh, here it is. A tshuva of Rav Uziel, the Piskei Uziel, the chief rabbi Uziel, who already discussed this many years ago, whether or not you can hear Havdalah on the phone, whether or not you can hear Megillah on the phone. He actually says that you're not Yotze because you're not hearing, he talks about more shofar. He says the shofar cannot be because you're not hearing the shofar itself, you're hearing the reflection of the shofar, not the shofar itself. Regarding Havdalah, if you go back to the source sheet, you will see that Rav Moshe talked about Havdalah. One second, let me just find the source on the sheet. Sorry, one second. I added some sources here, by the way. One second.
Number 7.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me. Thank you very much. Thank you. בעניין שמיעת הבדלה על ידי הטלפון לאישה הנמצאת בבית החולים, הנה אם אי אפשר שכאן הבדלה במקומה, ודאי יש לה לשמוע על הטלפון, because he says also Megillah and Havdalah משום דבכל מצוות דיבור ובכל וכמגילה לבד קריאת שמע ברכת המזון. He says using a microphone for קריאת שמע ברכת המזון is problematic. But mitzvot like Havdalah, where you just have to hear you don't have to hear the words actually. It's just that you have to be Yotze. That he says you can be done on telephone. לכן, כיוון שאי אפשר לשמוע הבדלה בבית חולים, better. וכן צריכה לענות amen. Moshe, this is a famous machloket. Moshe says you should answer amen on a bracha that you hear on a telephone or a microphone. Misafek, it's a question whether or not. Moshe says you should answer amen when you hear Havdalah on a telephone. So like I said, if you go, I added some sources here, by the way. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was adamant that you shouldn't do Megillah and Shofar on a telephone, and you're not Yotzei, while Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, source number 14 in front of you. I'm sorry I didn't send you on the source sheet, the original one. The Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank says, the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, B'kriyat Megillah or Torah, he says, Yeshlo ladun b'shafir yotze. Kol hakolot ksherim. Right? He says it all, the kolot of shofar, yotze, and he said that you could hear the Megillah and you can hear shofar on a radio or telephone. The bottom line is there are many, many different opinions. I remember that once where I live in Alon Shvut, one year the rabbi decided to read the Megillah on a microphone, and oh my gosh, half of the shul walked out. There was such a big machloket going on. The rabbi had to stop and start the Megillah again. There's a big machloket about this. So obviously, it would seem that if there's so many different opinions, whether or not you are actually hearing Megillah or not, probably better not to use the microphone, not to hear it on a radio. Obviously, in the cases like today, if there's no other choice, of course you should hear it. You should go by the opinions. I don't even understand how you can argue with that, right? If there are opinions out there, great rabbis that say that you can, so in a b'di'evet situation like today, obviously, and I think that Rav Moshe Feinstein is a great enough gadol to follow when it comes to Havdalah. For those who can't hear Havdalah, who can't make Havdalah, can't go for some reason, making Havdalah on Zoom would of course be a great solution. Obviously, if you have corona, you can't do Baruch Hamav, you can't make Barem Nebesamim. That would be a different problem. You can't smell. But joking aside, I'm saying Borei Aish, you could do yourself, but Havdalah you can hear from someone on a Zoom. That I think is quite simple. So if at this point it's if I would like to open. If people have questions or comments on what we said until now, I would love to hear comments and questions. Vakasha. Yes, please. Just I can't see everyone, so call out. Yeah.
I didn't appreciate before that when you form Bikur Cholim, that it's a mitzvah to daven for the good health of the chole in front of them. If you, God forbid, were unwell, and one of your friends came over and started davening for you in front of you, would you find that comforting?
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I wanted to mention that. Yeah, that's correct. Obviously, that would be very bad tact to do that in front of the person. Obviously, you go to the room next to or something like that, or in your prayers when you daven anyway, you mention the chole. Obviously, that has to be taken into consideration. I thought that was obvious that one should behave in a tactful way and not do it in front of. There was once a very funny skit going around about what not to do when you're Mevakar Cholim, and that was one of them. Right. So obviously, I think that would be very poor judgment to say to someone, "Listen, you look like you're dying. I'm going to pray for you." That is correct. I think that you have to use your judgment and your tact of how to do it in a way that would not upset that person. I will, however, say something just to balance what I just said now. There's a minhag. It's a minhag to that when someone is dying, you say vidui with someone. I never understood that because it like you said, a similar idea, right? How do you say vidui? Someone is dying, so to tell him it's time to say vidui, surely that might make him lose all hope in life, and we know that a person should never give up hope until the last minute. And I have to tell you that I was once in my life in that situation, that I was with someone in that situation. I'm want to go into detail right now. And a great rabbi who I adore and love very much did it in the most unbelievable way. I can't express enough how it was done in an incredible way that I felt that was the idea of what it's supposed to be done. I don't know if many people should do that. Meaning, I don't recommend doing it chas v'shalom in those situations for just anyone, because obviously, like you said, you have to be very careful when you visit someone sick or someone is even very, very sick. Anything that you can say can also chas v'shalom do the opposite. Then right, this is a place to say that the same goes for nichum avelim. There are cases when people visit mourners and make them angry, make them upset. Right? You have to be careful not to do harm when you're V'aker Cholim. You have to make sure that you don't do harm when you're Menachem Avelim. I imagine that if we go around this Zoom and people that sat Shiva in the past probably are able to share certain phrases and things that people said, I can testify about that myself, about certain things that I was so shocked that people said that was not much tact. So yeah, I agree with you that one obviously should take that into account if one prays for someone to be sensitive to the person in front of them, not to add chas v'shalom anything negative. Yes, Vakasha, Harold.
Okay, so two questions. Along those same lines, what did the Ramban have in mind as to what specific prayer one would say, if not directly, let's say at the bedside, but in the general presence or atmosphere of the chole? Just as an aside, I have a very close friend, a rabbi who is currently in Lakewood. Where after he and his wife moved to Lakewood, he got corona, and unfortunately, he's more or less been unresponsive for the last year. So I happened to be there a number of months ago, and so I saw him in the long-term care facility. He's unresponsive, so I decided I'd daven mincha. So I daven mincha right at his bedside. So there, obviously, there's the prayer that you insert, in Rofei Cholim, and I could actually mention his name during that. But other than that, what specific prayer would you say? I mean, the Ramban specify, like, what do you do, or you just have certain thoughts of Rachamim?
Right. So, okay. So thank you for that. I'm not aware. I can just, it's also the Rambam, like I said before, not only the Ramban, right? It's also, it's also the Rambam. Sorry a second. That book just fell. It's not only the Ramban, but also the Rambam. Both, right, mention this idea. I don't know. I can only guess saying Tehillim, saying Mishiberach Lachole. I'll just say something that obviously a lot of this is very personal, and people have to really act upon how they feel. When my Abba Alav Hashalom was very sick many years ago, not from the sickness that he died from, there was a time when he was very sick from something totally different, and I went to the hospital, and he was in an operation, and they told us that it's very touch and go, and we should be prepared for the worst. And I sat outside the operation room with a sefer, and I was learning. I remember I was learning the tshuva of the Chatam Sofer, and someone passed by and said to me, "What are you doing? You're learning. Why aren't you praying? Right? You should pray." So I said, "My father is a brisker. My father, I know that my father would prefer me to learn Torah for him because he believes in Torah." And when my father woke up from the operation, and I told him this, he was so happy to hear that. I don't know if there are rules here. I don't know if there's really, everyone should probably do whatever they feel is the best. If it's Tehillim, if it's their own words, if it's saying Mishiberach Lachole. I find that it's hard to answer that question.
Okay, second question. Before, though, I just wanted to mention regarding your father. So I learned with your father in 1994, 1995 in Cleveland when he was the first Rosh Kollel. My wife and I visited him a couple times. We should have visited many more times when he was ill on a ventilator at his home in Alon Shvut. And I always felt he was quite an amazing human being, tremendous life and vigor and joie de vivre, in addition to, obviously, he was a big Talmid Chacham. So it's very special for me specifically to hear a shiur from your mouth, really hopefully in the chus of your father, etc. Just 1 minute. Secondly, okay, so we have these friends, they're more Haredi, and they are widows, and they don't make up their own Havdalah. It's not their custom that a woman, whatever. So they get a phone call from their son, and they make Havdalah over the phone. On the other hand, the women, they are quite capable of making Havdalah for themselves. So what would the poskim say, do you think?
Off on start video.
So, okay. What would the poskim say with regard to that, do you think?
That's a great question. As you know, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah have a machloket regarding Havdalah. The Shulchan Aruch actually paskins that women are chayiv just like men, and women should be able to make Havdalah for men, no difference like Kiddush. The Ramah, it's a very strange Ramah. It's a very difficult Ramah. We don't paskin like him. The Bach paskins against the Ramah, and that's the minhag that women are chayiv in Havdalah. And even though Ashkenazi custom is not to have women make Havdalah for men, there's no question that the Ashkenazi poskim like the Bach and others paskin that women can make Havdalah for themselves without any question. I personally would advise in that case for women to make her own Havdalah, no question. That would be my better to make her own Havdalah than hear from a man on a phone. I don't even, I think that's quite simple. In my opinion, I'm sure there are other opinions out there.
So the poskim, all right, so the poskim you just quoted would probably, they would paskin that, most likely.
I imagine, but I just, I'm not being taped. I'm being recorded. I have to be just careful here. I would not be surprised if for certain reasons people would argue with me, but I do not believe that would be for the right reasons, but I don't want to get into it right now.
Okay, very good.
Mrs. Shah, you had your hand up, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I just wondered, we've had a situation in our family where a man left very, very clear instructions. He was a Holocaust survivor, that he was to be cremated. And in fact, he worked it so that it was very difficult for the family not to cremate him. And I was just interested in the sources, because after all, burial is for the mate. And he left very clear instructions. What do the sources say about that?
Yeah, so this is a more delicate question, if it's okay. These questions appear in halacha. I mean, there are discussions about these type of questions.
Right. This was some years ago. It's not a live.
Right. No. I heard this recent question not too long ago. Also, I mean, it happened again. It's a very delicate question. If it's okay, I'm happy to talk about it another time. But also time-wise, I don't think we have the time for it. But it's I mean, I know on my shelf even which books to refer to that talk about this here. But it is a question that does come up or came up, and Bigadol, I think that we it depends if it depends upon a lot of things. Yeah, I don't want to answer that right away. That's okay.
Okay, but it's all right.
It's a
But
question.
in terms of it being,
If you want to contact me privately, I'll just put my email here so that you can email me, and I'm happy to respond to this question privately. It's just a little bit of a more delicate question that I prefer. Oops, why can't I write in? I can't write in. Why can't I write in English? Oh, I don't know why. It won't let me write in English. Wait a second. No, why? 1 second. But my email is Aviad Tavori @gmail. Okay,
Lovely.
Aviad Tavori,
Thank you.
AVIAD Tavori with
Yeah.
a B @gmail. So please feel free to contact me. Beseder, everyone. I think we're going to stop here. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me seeing some people here that I know also happen to know my family, happen to know my family. Thank you very much for having me here today. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, good health, and stay healthy and safe. Kol Tov.